Welcome to R&R Livin' Life. This will be the last episode of our West Australian Great Central Road trip. In this episode, Rick and I hike in Carnarvon Gorge and then make our way towards home, stopping in at Miles on the way. Later in this episode, I will add a snapshot of our trip and a breakdown of the costs involved. We begin this episode at Sandstone Park Campground, just outside of Carnarvon National Park, that covers nearly 3,000 square kilometres and is some of central Queensland's wildest scenery, where the morning was quite cool and breezy, with the temperature registering -1, but it felt like -3, so a nice chilly start to the morning. Our hike starts at the information centre, with our aim to hike as far as we were comfortable. The main track begins with crossing Carnarvon Creek, our first crossing for the morning, over rounded boulders strewn across the riverbed. Carnarvon Creek that flows through the gorge has been shaped over millions of years. On the bank was a plaque indicating where the flood level had reached in April 1990. Something just to keep in the back of your mind if you are exploring gorges of any kind, as rain can fall further in the gorge without you knowing, causing creeks to rise. Whilst Carnarvon Gorge technically falls into the subtropics, the weather patterns are definitely influenced by the wet season of the tropics, and today was a beautiful day to hike, cool and clear. As we ventured further into the gorge, I marvelled at the spectacular steep-sided gorge with white sandstone cliffs in places towering over the creek. It was quite cool in amongst the trees, but I soon warmed up as we negotiated steps and the winding path. The gorge was primarily created by water erosion and contains ancient remnants of flora which in the drier zones above the gorge died out millions of years ago. We were to cross Carnarvon Creek a number of times as it wound its way through the gorge, with a number of tracks that led away from the main gorge track, and in places we could see the result of flood damage. For today we were just happy to hike the main track and see how the day unfolded. Ward's Canyon was closed due to flood damage, and as we got closer to Balimba Bluff, a grade 4 hike with steep slippery steps and lots of them, we decided to give it a miss. The track is mostly flat with steps in steeper places, but is generally a pleasant walk, though often shaded by the palms and edged by ferns and cycads. Our first stop for the morning was at the amphitheatre just off the main gorge track. To access the amphitheatre we had to climb a tiered ladder to a platform and then walk through a narrow crevice into the amphitheatre that can only be described as a secret sanctuary. Hidden inside the gorge walls is a 60-metre chasm hidden deep inside the gorge, gouged from the rocks over tens of thousands of years by running water. Moss and ferns blanketed the sandstone floor to create a surreal atmosphere, offering us a cool chamber. It was such a surreal place where Rick and I just sat in quiet contemplation and marvelled at the towering stone walls and the natural skylight that created this awe-inspiring natural formation. It really was an unusual place where the acoustics were remarkable and the echoes were eerie. After some quiet contemplation we continued along main track towards the art gallery, with the track winding along the valley floor and crisscrossing the Carnarvon Creek, where we used stepping stones that were so stable and well placed that even for me, who is unstable on my feet, could manage, and I can say I didn't get my feet wet. Each time the stream and rock pools were different, from wide stretches of sand to boulders, and then vegetation right to the water's edge. It really was a pretty creek. The art gallery hike is a 10.8 kilometre return walk, without the side trips into the amphitheatre and on our return to Moss Garden. But the main attraction in the park for us was the gorge itself. Extending for over 30 kilometres, it varied in width from about 40 metres to 400 metres, with the gorge walls towering up to 60 metres overhead. It was a stunning place, with the gorge having vast stands of spotted gum, cabbage palm and cycads, as well as ferns, elkhorns and lichens near the waterfalls. It was amazing to see some of the impressive ferns that have strong links with the ancient flora that dates back from the time when Australia was part of the larger continent of Gondwana. 600 metres off the main track was the Art Gallery, just one of the caves and cliffs that were a popular place for Aboriginals to gather and tell their stories. The gallery contains some of the finest examples of hand, axe, emu tracks and boomerang prints that I had seen on our travels anywhere across Australia. The ochre stencils of tools, weapons, ornaments and ceremonial objects also provided us with an insight into the lives of the gorge's first people. Here at the gallery, the Aboriginals painted the walls in red ochre and white, black and yellow pigments, using the technique of blowing pigment over a stencil, for example a hand. Apparently there are over 2,000 stencils, engravings and freehand paintings adorning the 62-metre long sandstone wall. I didn't bother counting them, but I know that it is one of the most impressive sights I have seen. A boardwalk, fencing and interpretive signage now keep idle hands away from the delicate sandstone and artworks, with the interpretive panels giving us an explanation about each motif. It has been estimated that many of the works date back 3,000 to 4,000 years, and some may date from 19,000 years ago. The art gallery, with its excellent boardwalk, contains some of the finest examples of stencil art in Australia. Rick and I sat in the shade enjoying the gallery while eating a snack, an enjoyable way to appreciate the sight and to rest before our return along the track. While resting, we had decided not to go any further on this hike and leave the rest of the gorge for another day. The hike to Cathedral Cave was about another 4 kilometres, and Big Bend at the end of the main walking track was a further kilometre on from Cathedral Cave. Our return journey was just as stunning as our hike out, seeing the tangle of peaks through the trees, the gorges that entered the main creek, and the sandstone cliffs. It really is one of the wildest regions we had been in. I can always find something interesting to look at, seeing it from a different perspective. In one spot on our hike, a helicopter was dropping equipment for repair work on a creek flat, if you could call it that, after having to negotiate between cliffs along the creek and through the trees. A nice piece of flying. As it was later in the morning, we passed quite a few other hikers making their way into the gorge, and by the time we reached the Moss Garden, a tour group had already settled in front of the pool. To get to the Moss Garden, we had to climb lots of steps, in and around the creek, over tree roots and across the creek, but the scenery was worth it. Just before the Moss Garden was a huge Moreton Bay fig, with roots that extended at least 6 metres above us. It was an impressive sight. The Moss Garden was like a glorious hidden grotto, where tiny crevices on the side of the gorge, tree ferns reached out to the sunlight, and a small waterfall gently cascaded over a rocky ledge into the pool below. With walls covered in mosses and ferns, with the constant dripping water off the sandstone walls, it really was a fairy tale place. I could only be impressed by the mosses, tree ferns and liverworts that provided us with such a tranquil stop on our hike. It was refreshing to return to the green oasis that surrounded the information centre just on 5.5 hours later, having hiked approximately 14 kilometres in all. We wandered beneath the tall eucalypts and palms amid grazing kangaroos and chattering birds after our hike, processing some of what we had seen and enjoyed. I think I will remember the towering sandstone cliffs, vibrant coloured side gorges, the diverse flora and fauna, and the Aboriginal rock art for many years to come. After our hike, we returned to Sandstone Park Campground and enjoyed the rest of the afternoon watching the changing scenery with our feet up. At the start of this episode, I mentioned that I would include a map of our travels and a breakdown of our travel costs. We spent a total of 137 days on the road, travelling for a distance of 23,894 kilometres. 16,761 kilometres of that was towing Gidget. The boat is a Nissan Patrol, and we tow Gidget, a Lotus Trooper off-road caravan. Fuel, as always, is the biggest expense, with it ranging from $3.50 at Warburton for Opal fuel and $1.91 in Toowoomba for unleaded 98, with the total fuel adding up to $12,435. In some places we had to use Opal 91 or 95, as 98 was not available, but overall had no difficulty refuelling the boat in any of the places we stopped. The average consumption was 23.97 litres per 100 kilometres. As we travelled using gas for the oven, heater and the barbecue, it cost us $205. I mentioned gas as it was the only thing we had difficulty finding a place to refill in both Port Hedland and Mount Isa. The remainder of the cost breakdown I will leave up to you to revisit, as food, accommodation, entertainment, activities are personal to individuals, and what Rick and I spent really came down to what we wanted. Also, the accommodation depends on if you spend all your time off-grid or decide to frequent caravan parks, though in some places it was hard to find free camps, and I think the trend is to close a lot of the free camps, especially along the Nullarbor and in parks and reserves. And also there was no camping on Aboriginal lands, which was most of the Great Central Road. On our return, we had to replace the windscreen after a bullseye stone chip below the wipers on the driver's side that we acquired near Regan's Ford in the wheat belt. We also had been missing a rear door seal we had been waiting on to be replaced, but had no evidence of dust at all in the boat. The caravan filter we replaced, though, was not overly dusty, and had the air conditioning looked at, as it was not working, a problem with the model we found out later. The only major issues we had were the fridge coming out of its cabinet due to the short screws that had been used in the manufacturing, and the microwave with an inside wall cracking, so stopped working after not liking the corrugations on the Great Central Road. The only other expense was to replace a tyre in Alice Springs after we had a puncture on the return journey from Fink. Overall, I think we had few issues, especially after some of the places we had been to. Rick and I had been amazed by how green the country was, but after such a great wet season, we could not have expected anything else, even to having to spend extra time exploring the Eyre Peninsula because the Nullarbor was closed to flooding. And thankfully we did miss the violent storm in Bunbury, as we had moved on the previous day. We had maybe 2 days when it was raining on the whole of our trip, both being travelling days, 4 cold mornings around 0, but beautiful days following. The geology of Western Australia was fascinating and intriguing, with some of the most dramatic and remarkable landscapes we had seen, so vastly different from the eastern states. Every region we have travelled had different physical features, and how they had been shaped, from the great Australian Bight to the rugged decaying sandstone cliffs with amazing rock formations off Kalbarri. Trying to compare the stunning colours of the Southern and the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, I wouldn't even try. I was staggered to see the cropping areas that had only recently been developed as late as the 1950s after research into best practices. For all that I enjoyed, there were some sad moments, with the decline in small towns and pastoral properties struggling to survive, especially in the remoter parts of the state. With the state's total population nearly equal to Brisbane, so much is crammed into the southwestern corner of the state, where services are more easily accessed and land more productive, leaving huge swathes of Western Australia isolated. If not for the huge number of mines, there would be fewer people in those areas. This vast outback, being about 1/3 of Australia and 10 times larger than the United Kingdom, is covered by so much that is desert, with mainly Aboriginal communities scattered across the area and huge mining companies processing minerals and wealth from the ground. With 12,500 kilometres of coastline and about 3,500 white sandy beaches, it has some of the most gorgeous scenery, cleanest beaches and stunning sunsets. Not only were we amazed by the beaches, but also the many dry salt lakes scattered across the countryside. Lake Ballard would have to be one of the most incredible places we visited. The jewel cave at Augusta, with its 3 caverns, was breathtaking. The stunning magnitude of the crystal formations, with one of the longest straw stalactites, was astonishing. Even the Nullarbor, with its flat, arid and almost treeless plains, the planet's largest single exposure of limestone bedrock, spanning millions of hectares across the state, was different from what I had expected, and Rick and I were not bored by its vastness. Western Australia, where the desert meets the sea. Would we do it again? You bet. What an adventure! We are so lucky in Australia to have such a diverse and stunning country. There was so much history, both Aboriginal and European, that I really enjoyed, not to mention the contrasting landscapes, surreal natural wonders, and absolutely amazing country. It certainly was an amazing trip. As this episode comes to a close, we leave Sandstone Park Campground and make our way through Injune and Roma and on to Miles before returning home. About 10 kilometres from Injune we encountered a very strong headwind, so decided to stop in Injune and stretch our legs and see if the wind would abate. But unfortunately it did not, so we had to continue on to Roma, boasting a proud history built on agriculture and mining, and where Harry Redford stood trial for theft of a white bull and cattle from Bowen Downs. From Roma we continued heading home through the little towns of Wallumbilla, Yulbar, Jackson, Dulacca and Drillam, all little towns we had previously stopped in on our Western Queensland trip in 2023, before stopping to overnight with family in Miles. We ended up having a headwind all the way to Miles, certainly not the way we had hoped to finish our trip. We arrived home the following day. Thankfully, the last leg of our trip was without the wind. I hope you have enjoyed this, our last episode of our Western Australia, Great Central Road, Northern Territory and Queensland trip. Give us a thumbs up if you have. Thank you for those who have liked my photographs. Stay tuned for further episodes, wherever the road may take us. Take care and stay safe. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary. R&R, living life.